Greetings and peace, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. I would like to begin this with Bismillah. And also, it's an honor and privilege of being joined by my Murshid, my Sheikh, my friend and brother, Sheikh Wahid Azal of the Fatimiyya Sufi order, who returns with part 14 in these series of conversations and dialogues that we've been having, which will be continuation of part 13, which will be about free will and predestination. And I also wanted to take a moment to give my sympathy and condemn the attacks that happened in Peshawar against the Shia peoples, and which is such a tragedy. And I have to say that the work that we are doing with the Fatimiyya is super important. And I condemn the people in Pakistan who are pushing this hatred between Shia and Sunni and Shia. And that's not what Islam teaches us. And those people are not Muslims. And I give my sympathies and I prayers that Allah rest the souls in peace of those that were affected in this attack. And this is the reason why I'm with Sheikh Wahid Azal and the work that we are doing against this ignorance and this hatred. So without further ado, Nur alaikum to Sheikh Wahid. Thank you so much for being back.
Alaikum Nur. Let's start with this podcast with the following. Here on your podcast, I am issuing a fatwa. And my fatwa is being issued against these takfiri groups in Pakistan who make this attack against innocent Shia believers, praying and seeking the safety of their lives and families. My fatwa is the following. These takfiris, Barlevi, Taliban, Deobandi, whatever derivatives they have, these people are kuffar. These people are mushrikeen. These people are muharibin alillah. They are those who are warring against God. Therefore, as far as I'm concerned, these people are outside of the fold of the deen, the deen al-haq. And all the true believers should take whatever precautions necessary to protect their lives and the lives of their families. But these people are najis al-ayn, from legal category of fiqh, which means that these people are impure in their essences, these takfiris. That is my fatwa. So, people need to take these precautions to mind. I don't necessarily wish to call for violence against these people because these sorts of things have a habit of creating dynamics of their own, but individuals and people have a right to protect their families.
Indeed.
And when the police and law enforcement in Pakistan is impotent to do so, right, then people have to take matters into their own hands to protect themselves and protect their loved ones.
Absolutely.
And this is my fatwa, my overall fatwa over this issue. My heart goes out to some of my murids in Pakistan, such as Sayyid Gilani and her family, her husband Farjad. They're not in Peshawar, but they are amongst the Shia of Pakistan. And these sorts of behaviors that we're seeing from these takfiris obviously have subtext, and the subtext being that it's part of the larger proxy war that is going on between the so-called Eurasianists and the Yankees.
That's right.
Innocent people are being caught in the crossfire of this dirty, criminally motivated war between these two factions, and that goes for Shia and Sunni and others. The Ismaili community that is still, there's Ismailis in Pakistan, also Ahmadiyya Muslims that are in Pakistan. And this is one of the reasons why I have called on for such a long time that there needs to be a third force in this world, because these two forces, it is so cartoonishly Orwellian, are trying to push humanity into choosing one side or the other. And both, it is like, getting humanity choose between Iblis or another demon. Yes. That is not a choice. That's a false dialectic, right? Meanwhile, people are getting hurt. Governments don't do anything. Governments themselves are infiltrated by various interest groups that are associated with these sorts of interests. And our world is going to hell in a handbasket. People's lives mean nothing. The environment obviously is in the situation it is. Governments are not doing anything. I mean, we had here, if people have watched the news, we had a massive weather emergency here in Southeast Queensland last week, where there was literally a rain bomb for 5 days, and this city flooded. The last time we had this level of flooding here was about in 2011, and so about blocks from where I'm living here, there's houses that have been completely flooded, destroyed. The damage has been unbelievable. And this went on for 5 days, just rainbow. And so this is the situation we find ourselves in the world right now, with nobody having the capacity or capability to step forth from governments and the leaders that we have on this planet. We're not leaders at all. Most of them are corrupt. On all sides. I'm not saying one side or another. It's not just Russia. That the Western mainstream media is completely obsessed with Russia at the moment for obvious reasons because of the invasion of Ukraine, but they don't tell their viewership that much of the actions that Russia is engaging, number one, was a trap that NATO laid for Vladimir Putin to do what he did. And number two, they have been pushing for this very conflict in Central Europe for quite a long time now. Not even beginning in 2014 with that Euromaidan, but even before that, ever since the Soviet Union went down, NATO and consecutive American administrations have pushed the borders of NATO all the way to the Russian border itself. This was a mistake. This was against every undertaking that U.S. presidents made with Mikhail Gorbachev, Reagan, and then Bush Senior, and then later with Boris Yeltsin via Mr. Clinton and whatnot. So the bad faith of the West has triggered this situation that can very surely escalate into a situation where we have, where this planet is looking down the barrel of nuclear war. You have two nuclear powers, both of them, are deadly, and this is the situation we find ourselves. I mean, Ukrainians, yes, they have a independent history of their own, but the fact of the matter is that the histories of Russians and Ukrainians have always been intrinsically the same, and it's only been since the 20th century.
Yes.
Where all of a sudden these narratives of separation between Ukrainians and Russians have been pushed. Russian civilization itself begins in Kiev about 1,000 years ago, the civilization of Kiev and Rus. But ever since the 20th century, all of a sudden we have these narratives of Ukrainian nationalism that really has not existed. The only difference between Russians and Ukrainians has always been on the level of religion. The majority of Ukrainians are Catholic, whereas the Russians are Eastern Orthodox. That has been it. Their language is almost identical. It's almost the Ukrainian and Russian languages are almost a dialect of each other. It's like someone from the East Coast of the United States talking to someone in the Deep South. That's the only difference. It's still English, maybe a different accent or dialect, but it's still the same language.
Yes.
And then also intermingling and people living together, there has never been this issue. But once we moved into the 20th century, this became an issue. Primarily, I think maybe, to some degree, Vladimir Putin may be correct that the Bolsheviks made a mistake in creating this Ukrainian oblast that they did in 1921, because prior to that, Ukraine was just an integral province of Greater Russia itself. But, by the same token, this narrative of Russian nationalism that we're seeing today under the Putinist regime is no different than the kind of nonsense that was happening in Europe during the 1930s.
This is so important, Sheikh, because now people have to realize the importance of having a third force and what you're addressing, because now the world is suffering so much. We're seeing COVID, how it has devastated the world. Now the supply chains are shorted out, natural disasters, prices are through the roof. People are fighting with each other. There's death, destruction, greed, chaos, and also these Takfiris and Barelvis and Deobandis in Pakistan. It's such a disgusting mix that has developed into this world, and the righteous people have to take action. And I'm honored that Allah has brought you into my life and the work that we are doing for the Fatimiyya order, and to continue to push for this change that we need in the world, because we see no one else doing it.
Nobody else is doing it. Nobody else is doing it. And we have a Fatimi brother and his family in the Ukraine.
Yes.
My brother, Maxim Katrich. And I have been worried about him and his family, throughout the escalation of this conflict. And now that the conflict has come, these are good people, former, communists of the Soviet era who still look back at that era with some level of nostalgia, when these sorts of ethnic divisions did not exist under the USSR. They were suddenly ignited out of nowhere, beginning with beginning in the 90s.
Yes.
All completely manufactured and stoked and exacerbated by Western meddling. And so here we are, we're in a situation that potentially can unleash World War III.
Yes.
If we're not there already. And this is, if anybody thinks that this is good or this is going to bring a better world, they really need their head examined.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you're dealing with two nuclear powers, with the kind of arsenals that they have. But these are the times, and so this sort of is a segue to some of the things that I will talk about today. I got a lot of feedback after we made that last podcast on predestination and free will. People wanted clarification, so I spent a couple of days on email answering people's questions on that. Some of it, I think they were satisfied with some of my answers.
Mm-hmm.
But there's an element, at least from the Shiite angle, when we're dealing with the question of free will and predestination, that kind of nuances this overall question a little bit more, that makes the question a less mechanical than it appears. The first place I will start, and this is a very central issue in Shia theology that appears in the Kitab al-Tawhid of Khomeini. This is the first of the canonical books of Shia Hadith.
Right.
Where first of all, the Imams talk about the 7 attributive imprints of creation. We have chapters 24, 25, and 26 of Kitab al-Tawhid of Khomeini's Usul Min al-Kafi dealing with elements of this. And the 24th chapter is actually one of the most important chapters because it deals with the question of al-bada, the alteration of the divine plan. Which really nuances this question of free will and predestination. But I will start with the attributive imprints.
Yes.
This is a hadith attributed to Imam Jafar al-Sadiq alayhi salam, where he's asked about how God brings things into being, and his answer is, well, la fi samawa ila. He says, لا يكون شيء في الأرض ولا في السماء إلا بهذه الخصال السبع بمشيئة وإرادة وقدر وقضاء وإذن وكتاب وأجل, or alternatively another manuscript, أجل والكتاب. There is nothing in the heavens and the earth that do not come into being by these 7 attributive imprints. And these are the divine will, the divine volition, the divine determination, the divine authorization, the divine permission, the divinely allotted or appointed time, and the cosmic book. And this is my translation of it. In a hadith that comes immediately after that 25th chapter, this hadith is attributed also, said the following, to Hassan, to the 7th Imam Musa ibn Jafar alayhi salam, where he says there's nothing in the heavens or the earth without these 7. The decree, qadar, let me read the Arabic. لا يكون شيء في السماوات ولا في الأرض إلا بالسبب بقضاء وقدر وإرادة ومشيئة وكتاب وأجل. This is the order of this is kind of different than the last one. It says there's nothing in the heavens and the earth that does not come into being by the divine determination, then by the divine volition, the divine will, the divine book, and the divinely allotted time. Now, these 7 attributive imprints have been the subject of incessant commentary in the commentary traditions, and particularly by several members of the School of Isfahan, or later School of Isfahan, the students of Mullah Sadra, such as his 2 sons-in-law, but especially one of their eminent students by the name of Ghazi Saida Qawmi, who is sort of a Shiite Ishraqi, not so much a follower of Mullah Sadra's existentialist philosophy, but a sort of a Shiite Ishraqi in his own right. And he commented extensively on elements of this. But when we get to the Sheikhi school of Sheikh Ahmed al-Ahsa'i, these 7 attributive imprints become an especially important key for understanding, various metaphysical issues that are strewn out throughout the Hadith literature that appear contradictory from one or another. So these attributes, this is the way that God creates the world. First Godhead wills something, then it volites. Now, volition and will are related. Usually when you look up a dictionary, volition is a synonym to will. But in the Shia Hadith and in the commentary tradition by these Safavid and post-Safavid Islamic Shiite philosopher, The will is the immediate latent volition, whereas the volition is the active. So one is the one that comes first. It is the idea of something that is willed, right? With the volition, it's something being the action that it undertakes, the chain it unleashes, which then establishes the determination of something, right? So in the qadar of something, to determine something, we get the word taqdir, which is which also means the predestination of something, something's pre-eternal or already always or illo tempore thingliness or being, or what in the mind of God is determined for something. That is its taqdir, that is the level of the qadar. Then comes the divine authorization for the existentiation of something, the qada. Then comes the permission of God for the existentiation of that thing. Then the last two elements of this is the ajal and the kitab. So the ajal, the appointed time or the allotted time of something, is the periodization of its existentiation. Whatever that thing might be. Maybe it's an event, there's a person, or a thing, whatever. And then finally, it's complete existentiation within the cosmic book, which means that it comes into being within the universe itself. Book, kitab being a cipher for the universe as such, right? Now, these 7 attributive imprints then play a very central role in explaining another doctrine that is extremely central to Shiism, and that is propounded in this Kitab al-Tawheed of Khulaini by the Imams, and that is the question of al-bada. Al-bada, we usually translate it as the alteration in the divine plans, right? So that God can basically will something and then change his mind at a certain point in the future. With a lot of Sunni theologians, they kind of look at this as a contradiction, that if God wills something from pre-eternity, then how can God change its mind about this thing? What is going on? So what the Imams answer, and this occurs in the 24th chapter, that deals with the question of bada, is quite interesting, right? In this chapter 24 of the Kitab al-Tawheed, Bab al-Bada, the chapter of Bada, the Imams say that God, right, there's one hadith particularly, this is hadith number 362, says God did not send any prophet without 3 conditions. The acknowledgement of being its servant and worshiper, that there is nothing like it, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may bring forward whatever it wills, and may take back whatever it wills at any time, right?
That's right.
But then the question is, at what point during this chain of creative attributive imprints does the question of the alteration of the divine plans occur? There's various different questions. We have one hadith in another compilation by one of the Imams that says that the alteration of the divine plans happens at the level of the qada, not on the level of the determination, but on the level immediately after it, the authorization. Then there are other hadith that state that it happens actually on the level of the ajal, the appointed or the allotted time of something. So the alteration of the divine plan over something, if God, for example, decrees the existence of something and then takes it back or withholds it. Number one, this tells us that the All-High is capable of doing whatever it wills at any time, right?
Yes.
But this also, as many commentators have pointed out, the issue of al-bada, it also instances the fact that with the Quran and the revelation of the Quran, the Prophet, we have all these verses that were revealed and then abrogated by the Prophet. So as above, so below. Just as verses are revealed that the messenger, who is the embodied logos, can abrogate at a later time or withhold, or certain insights and wisdoms and revelations that came to the Prophet that some hadith say he did not disclose, right? The question of bada functions in the same way on the higher cosmic level. So God, at that level of either the authorization or the appointed time of something, can suddenly withhold that thing from coming into being, or push the time or the appointed time of something at a later date. Then this is kind of queried of the Imams. Well, why does the Al-Hayy do this? And then the question is then framed in the context of eschatology and the coming of the Mahdi. And one of the Imams answers this question in a very interesting way that I think many people should take aboard, because I've kind of mentioned this in other podcasts, that prophecies are extremely tricky things. And this hadith confirms this. It says that if the mu'mineen, if those expectant of the coming of the Messiah, of the coming of the Mahdi,
Yes.
are only fixated on the signs of the coming, they are veiled by the Mahdi's coming. So they're not seeking the Mahdi, they're seeking the signs. So al-bada, the alteration of the divine will, is also a test by the Al-Hayy to distinguish the wheat from the chaff, to see who are the truly expected, who are actually looking beyond the signs and looking for the manifestation itself,
Yes.
rather than the signs, right? So the signs then become the veils to the Mahdi himself. And this is what Bada is trying to teach us. And they also say, this is a statement that occurs both in Hadith and also then occurs in the Bayan by the Bab, that God is not worshipped in any other form other than to be worshipped by the reality of al-Bada, of the alteration in divine place. Alteration in terms of what humans think, because we have a limited perspective. We're living in a spatio-temporal world where the causalities occur in time, where usually but not always the law of non-contradiction applies in our universe. But with God, who is on a much higher inscrutable realm of being that transcends spatio-temporality, all these events will occur as a singularity, such that even the issue of Bada is an already always decree of the Al-Hayy at its level. So I hope this kind of this explains this kind of dialectic between predetermination and free will to people. It is a deep issue, but is ultimately one that cannot, in my opinion anyway, be resolved very simply by logical arguments, and especially using the Aristotelian system of excluded middles. The person that came the closest to really resolving this question, to my satisfaction, from the lineage of Islamic philosophy, was none other than Sheikh Wahid Azal. He's done an amazing job in countless places. But
Yes.
where this question then begins to become very interesting is in the tetralemma of logic that Sheikh Wahid Azal himself introduces to try to understand what is going on. And that is, for example, in Ishraqi philosophy of Suhrawardi, and then all who followed him, we have the question of the union of the knower and the known, right? Sheikh Ahmad Azal accepts this proposition, but unlike all of them who followed the logic of Avicenna, where they make the actor, the act, and the one acted upon a single thing. So there is the actor and the act are known as a singularity, and then the patient, or the one acted upon, is the second term. Sheikh Ahmad Azal actually proposes the following tetralemma. He says that where, for example, thought is concerned, we can say that thought and the thing thought about, right, or the aql and the ma'qul are one. So that which is thought and that which, the thought itself, the fil, the actual thinking and the thing are one. However, the aql, the one thinking, is not, there is no union between the process and the outcome. And this is a very interesting thing, because then once you put this tetralemma on the level of trying to explain both predetermination and free will, and also then the question of bada, this becomes an extremely interesting way of unpacking and understanding the paradox. And this tetralemma, this logical tetralemma, so we have there are three terms: the fa'il, fil, maf'ul, the actor, the action, and the one acted upon. The action and the one acted upon, or its patient, are a singularity. They are the same. They are union. But the thinker is not. Right? So there is a separation. And that on the level of theology, so, there is God, there is the decree of be, kun, fayakun. Right? And then there is the existentiation of that thing.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
but
absolutely right,
there's a
Sheikh.
separation between there's a separate there's a separation between these two processes, right? And that becomes a very that becomes the lens in which we can understand not just the question of predetermination and free will, but also a lot of other metaphysical issues involved, without falling into traps that unfortunately many Sufis have fallen into in trying to make a compromising the transcendence of God by saying that the existent and the existence are one and the same, right? Sheikh Ahmed Asai responds by saying that no, that's not. The existentiator is one term, the existence is another term, and that which is existent is the third term. The existence and the existent can be a singularity, but the existentiator, al-wajid, is a term unique to itself. And this then
Great.
does not compromise the transcendence of God. Whereas, yes, there is a chain of causality, right?
Hmm.
But the placement of where these various rungs of this chain of causality then become very important. And so then we don't fall into traps like pantheism and the like.
Yes. That is absolutely beautiful, Sheikh, and that is the ultimate truth. And I'm glad you pointed this out because coming from the Shia tradition of the Fatimiyya Tariqa, I even looking into the Ahlul Bayt or Imam Jafar as-Sadiq and the probability of the 70,000 different worlds and timelines and the probabilities of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his glory and majesty can do the aspect of kun fayakun, even with what Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani rahmatullah alayhi described in his teachings as well, about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can change one situation and change it like in that amount of a time. So
Yeah.
that those are the different probabilities that we're looking at. And I've seen the most truth that I've come across, even in my understanding, is in the esoteric Shia traditions of these different imams of the Ahlul Bayt, which comes to my question, Sheikh, and I'm just so amazed by this information, even the trap that many Sufis fall into, the aspects of us being a projection of the divine, but it's more to it than that.
Oh
And
yeah.
it just comes to my question is, what would Imam Jafar as-Sadiq or the teachings of Ahlul Bayt and the free will and predestination describe this Russia and Ukraine situation we're seeing today?
Well, wow, what a, what a great question. They would look at two, powers of kuf going at each other. Basically what I said, there are the meek of this planet, which is all of us,
Yes.
the collective of humanity, and these plutocrats and oligarchs and their governments and their interest groups, etc., who are basically victimizing everybody, including their own people, in this situation. And this, from the point of view of whether we're talking about the Shia Imams or whether from the point of view of the Quran itself, this is the sowing of corruption on earth. So these powers are mafasid fil ard, the corruptors of the earth, which, from the point of view of the Quran, makes these people the legions of hell, as far as we are concerned. But there are Muslims amongst this crowd. We're not just talking about Eastern Orthodox Russians or just the secular post Enlightenment West and postmodernists. There are many Muslims. Whether in Iran, for example, I consider to have made itself practically into a vassal state of Vladimir Putin and Russia over the years.
Yes.
And so they are following lockstep in everything that Russia is saying and doing without any volition of their own. So this is the problem that we have at the moment.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it's the same basically even in my home country of Pakistan. It's basically a satellite. It's a satellite at this point of the CCP. And that's what I've noticed is whether you have Iran or Pakistan, those they're a lot of them are influenced by that Eurasian crowd in that part of the world. And they get used against each other or in the grand scheme of things, like in terms of internal warfare, external warfare. And that's what we're seeing. There is a decision that humanity has to make in terms of the COVID, the natural disasters, the wars that are out there. There's just so much hatred, Sheikh, and it's so much hatred that I see. And it's truly a blessing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed great teachers and sheikhs like yourself to do the great work that you're doing. And of course, just like Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had to deal with the Quraysh. It's
Mhm.
those same forces exist right now on this earth that are targeting
Absolutely.
those that are of the light. And
Absolutely.
it's just going to show us with free will and predestination where in the grand scheme of things are the next 20 to 30 years taking us.
Well, by the will of the All High, at least for the next 20 years, that I'm pretty sure, maybe a little less, that I'll be around this rock. It is incumbent. This is the task that the All High has put before me, is that we actually bring this third force about.
Mm.
So that means that those people who are genuinely interested in making a better world, I ask them to join me, whether they're in the Muslim world or not, whether they're Muslim or not. I don't insist on people necessarily converting. If they want to, they are welcome to, and I will take their conversion, no problem. But the world demands a different framework of doing things. On the one hand, we are dealing with very similar archetypes that we have dealt with in the past. I had this conversation last night with someone in Brazil, where I explained to them that the world that we're living in today on a global level is very much like the period of the Jahiliyyah in Mecca, right?
Indeed.
Whereas, back then the Talguts or the idols, the Asnam, were made of wood and stone, and a certain, elite of that town was making a lot of money from it. Today we have many, many Talguts of the mind, and this also is on the level of many of the established religions.
Yes.
Who are making money and misleading and veiling humanity while they all laughed all the way to the bank. This is exactly what the Quraysh were doing. They made Mecca into a caravan route where all kinds of people were coming and housing their idols in the Kaaba, and then they were charging money for that. And as a result of these caravan routes and the charging of money, the Quraysh became extremely wealthy. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, comes out of that clan of the Quraysh himself, from the Banu Hashim, but he then is the one from that clan that becomes the opposition to that entire state of affairs and says, La ilaha illallah. Now you think about this in a time where you have an elite in a town like Mecca of that period, whose entire lifestyle, well-being, money, livelihood, everything is dependent on idolatry. Whether they believe in this stuff or not is completely immaterial, because obviously the Abu Sufyans and all those people who rallied against the Prophet and the early Muslims, they were not believers in any of the stuff they're housing the idol. This was a business to them. And here comes Muhammad, peace be upon him, and says La ilaha illallah. So he's not just challenging the theology of idolatry, which is happening just by that very statement. He is challenging the entire social fabric of that society of Mecca by saying La ilaha illallah.
Yes.
Right? And we know the outcome of that struggle. So in a sense, these times demand that same struggle on the part of the true muwahhideen of this planet, of whatever faith or creed they come from. And this is why I call our way, if we are the Fatimiyya Sufi order, our tariqah or our sirat is known as the Nur, right? And the Nur is all encompassing, because the Nur itself, the light, it contains all ideologies, right?
Yes.
The only thing that the Nur demands is sincerity, sidq. So if human beings have sidq and they wish to enter the Nur, they can. And this is also what Islam originally was saying. The Quran itself says that the Sabians, Christians, the Jews, all those who are submitters, Muslimun, are Muslim. And that Islam is the Deen al-Haq. And this is a very interesting question, because when we start going back to the original sources, right, Islam was never seen as a noun by the founders. Islam was seen as a verb. And it's an all-encompassing verb that encompasses anyone of any tradition who submits to the reality of the All High, right? And not a creed. And so this changes the configuration of everything that we understand about what this stuff all means. So in this day, I am calling what the Quran called Islam the Nur.
Yeah, that's it, and that is the best way to put it, Sheikh, because it says even in the Quran, like you said, Surah 2, verse 62, that as long as you're submitting to the higher power, then that is the act of submission. And on the day of judgment, you shall have no grief for judgment. And that is the time that we're living in. And I thank you also for your new blog post explaining about the light of Nur and why we say Nur alaykum and alaykum Nur to each other, because it is the aspect of the light. And to
Yes.
connect each other by being the true righteous individuals, because honestly, the true initiation, it happens from within the heart. And if your heart is pure, that's exactly where the true key is. The true key is within the heart. And when you submit to your murshid and to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to collectively know that we're all guiding each other home in many ways.
It's guiding the light to the light, which is a refrain from one of Sufi prayers that I've always used, guide the light unto the light.
Yeah.
So when we say Nur alaykum wa alaykum Nur, we're basically, doing this very thing. We're guiding the light to the light, but also since love and light are connected realities, when you say Nur alaykum to somebody and they respond wa alaykum Nur, you're saying, I love you. And they're responding, I love you too.
Yes.
Because these two are interconnected realities, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, just as the early Muslims and just as the Prophet, introduced salam alaikum,
mm-hmm.
right? Peace be upon you. Because why? Now, a lot of people don't question this, but this is in all of the histories and in a lot of hadith. Why did the Prophet, introduce the greeting of Islam as salam alaikum and wa alaikum salam? For a simple reason, because those Arabs at that time were constantly at war with each other,
Yes.
right? And the reality that Islam wanted to bring into the ummah it was creating was peace and brotherhood amongst people, so that people can enter the presence of each other in peace without drawing each other's sword and wanting to massacre each other on first sight, which these Arabs were doing before that.
Yes.
So we are in our own time recreating that paradigm, but on a higher tenuity by saying Nur alaykum, because we, the assumption is that whoever comes into the Fatimiyya, whoever comes into the Nur has already established that peace within themselves. So now we're taking it one step further. We're going from the peace and into the Nur itself, which is the animate reality of the Allah.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it's like what you said, it's about finding that peace within yourself, which goes to my next question, Sheikh, and I am tempted to ask this, that in the chaos that we see in the world today, on how we have discussed on these dialogues and conversations, the Duginist and the Baha'i crowd, how do you define these two players in terms of what's happening right now?
They are the minions of the Iblis. They are the minions of the Dajjal. They are part of the system of the Antichrist.
Yes.
And these are amongst many of the forces that we need to overcome as a species in order to create our new world. There is just no other way, because these are the destroyers of our world.
That's absolutely right.
All of these various forces are about the enslavement of the human race. We want to free the human race.
Mm-hmm. And that's very interesting, Sheikh, because now we see the aspect of Dugin's Russia or Vladimir Putin now backed into a corner where now the entire world is against him in a big way. How do you see this in terms of your knowledge and understanding? How do you see this playing out in terms of its resolution?
Well, if you've looked at Russia long enough, as I have, you begin to see this as a bit of there's a bit of theater and farce involved in a lot of this, because as I have been on record many times saying, I have looked at Russia, especially over the last 8 years, as no more than a corporate satellite of the West.
Yes.
And the reasons for this are manifold, particularly given the fact that after the fall of the USSR, Boris Yeltsin basically invited American and Western capitalist entrepreneurs and also military people into Russia, and they just poured right in. And it is on the back of this where Yeltsin himself and all these Russian oligarchs became extremely wealthy because they were doing business with these American capitalists and Western entrepreneurs.
Right.
So the West has full knowledge of Russia from the point at which the USSR collapsed to the present time. So how is it that this power of Vladimir Putin is all of a sudden against the West, where his entire livelihood, his wealth, his power, and that of the oligarchs that work with him was established on the back of help and business relationship with these Americans. See, the Western plutocracy, Western capitalism and Russian capitalism have deep entanglements. And these entanglements go back to that period of 1991. So I look at this as a false dialectic. The powers that be, seek conflict as a mechanism of making money, and they don't care how many millions of innocent people die. They proved this in the Second World War.
Yes.
A book that I recommend anyone who really wishes to understand what happened, what was the whole narrative, what really was behind the Second World War, should go and get my friend Yoda Preparata's book, Conjuring Hitler: How America and Britain Made the Third Reich. Because that is what it is. That you had American companies, American corporations, basically building up Adolf Hitler in the Third Reich, right, and then pushing him into the situation that they did, with first the taking of Austria, then Czechoslovakia, and then finally the invasion of Poland in 1939, and then all of a sudden World War II ignites. We have 6 years of destructive war on both the European continent and then in the Pacific. At the end of it, these so-called Axis powers are defeated, and then these disaster capitalists go in and rebuild the continent and the world and make a financial killing. Then we have about 40 plus years of a Cold War that again made more money for the arms industry and the military industrial complex that Eisenhower warns about in his 1961 farewell speech. The Cold War ends with an so-called American victory after they lured Russia into Afghanistan in almost an identical fashion as they have lured Vladimir Putin into Ukraine. The Soviet Union collapses as a result of all the various pressures on it, whether from its disastrous campaign in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1988, or the arms race that the Americans won by sheer money, and then lies, the information and misinformation and targeting of the USSR and the Eastern Bloc that happened on the part of the United States and its allies. Then after that collapses, immediately the West needs a new enemy, right? The arms industry needs a new enemy. So now the focus of enmity for the West goes from being the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc and Soviet communism, to becoming who? The Muslim world.
Yes.
So then this plays out, for the next decade and a half or whatnot. And meanwhile, they are building up Russia, and then all of a sudden, Vladimir Putin, emerges on the scene in the late 90s as Boris Yeltsin is beginning to ail, and that man was completely senile by the end of his presidency. And they build him up, and then start to build him up into a cartoonish villain character. But they build him up in such an interesting way where, they are, first of all, building him and his profile as this macho, defiant, figure who's playing this 3D chess against the Western powers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, doing business with these very same Western powers, that made him super wealthy, and his friends, his oligarchic friends. And then steadily from around end of 2013 from now, Russia becomes increasingly more a pariah. They're almost reviving the Cold War narrative of Russia with all the Russophobia and everything attached thereunto, until we head into this present conflict, which, as far as I'm concerned, whatever lingering respect I would have for Vladimir Putin evaporated, because this was such a stupid act, and it was and he has proven himself to be such a chump. To get lured into Ukraine in exactly the same way that Brezhnev got lured into Afghanistan.
Yes.
That it now proves to me, at least, the narrative that this entire conflict is a manufactured conflict. It's not real. But it's real in the sense that real people on the ground are getting killed, whether you're talking on the level of the militaries of each side, or the people caught in the crossfire of all of this.
Yeah, and thank you, Sheikh, for telling this, because it's, in the end, it's all a game. It's a game by these people who are, even when you look at the wrestling, the WWE, they're all friends. They're all like enemies, and then they're friends. Then the good guys, the bad guy becomes the good guy. And then behind the scenes, they're all connected with each other. They're all helping each other, and that's exactly the game that we're dealing with right now. And innocent people get caught in the middle, whether it's they get hurt economically with the sanctions, whether they're suffering from death or destruction, being caught in the crossfire. it's such a crossroads that humanity finds itself in, and I thank you for sharing the things that you have.
I have no love for the Russian establishment. The sooner they go to hell, the better.
Mhm.
But my heart absolutely goes out to the Russian people in the same way that it goes out to the Ukrainian people, because these people deserve better than they have been getting over the
Yes.
last 20 years, since the 30 years since the fall of the USSR. And we need to really, we really need to understand this. And this is the reason why it is becoming more and more urgent by the day that rather than the geopolitics of the world playing a cartoonish version of Orwell's 1984, which is exactly what is happening,
Mhm.
because even in that narrative of Orwell's book, he actually telegraphs the very thing that you just said, where, they're enemies on one day, then they're playing with each other the next day, one day they're friends, the next day they're enemies, one day Eurasia is against Atlantia, the next day they are friends, and they're all both against Oceania. This is exactly what's happening.
Yes, that's absolutely right, Sheikh. And it's all this time that we're living in. Now we get back to the question of free will and predestination. If we look into the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt coming from the Shia tradition, what would they say in terms of the aspects of, let's say, in our current situation, but in generally speaking, in terms of free will and predestination, with applying to our current world situation and also generically of the human being in his individual journey? What esoteric teaching can we get from the Ahlul Bayt and the Shia esoteric tradition?
Well, this tradition is saying the following: that God All High is calling humanity to take its own freedom.
Yes.
Right?
Mhm.
But the only way that freedom can be taken is if this humanity elevates itself to the All High.
Mhm.
Right? So we have a lot of verses in the Quran and also in Hadith that condemn the powers of the time on a continual basis and point out the corruption of kings and empires. All of this suffices at this very moment, and those Muslims were, basically following the Pied Piper of Hamelin the Pied Piper of the Kremlin, as I call Alexander Dugin, down the precipice, need to wake up and realize that this sort of thing was anticipated in the Quran, in the revelation of the Quran, and also in the Hadith. They need to take their authenticity. They need to they need to take their freedom and authenticity by the will of the All High. And
Yes.
once that happens on a mass level, then we are in a position to basically push these powers out. Because look, power, we're still not at a stage where we can say that either artificial intelligence or robots can compel humans to do anything. We're not at that stage yet. Everything still at this very moment exists. Power is built on consensus, and consensus occurs on the level of the noosphere in the mind.
Mhm.
So human beings can change their mind. If they change their mind from a higher perspective, then these powers can be brought down.
This is
Simple as that.
this is great. And it also the aspects of what you said about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Sheikh, can, let's say, a lot of the Sufis that fall into the trap that we are a representation, all of us, of that divinity. How do you differentiate when it's the source is separate and when it's acting through a vessel or an instrument to do its will?
Well, these all, I mean, you have to take all of these on a case by case basis, because sometimes it is really happening, and other times it is not happening. The only way that a person can distinguish these situations is to have that ma'rifah. When you have that ma'rifah, the oasis, when your faith is solid as a rock on those two pillars of itqan, perfection, and iqan, certitude, right? And you've gone as deep as you possibly can into, and then you are in the presence of that eternal nur, then you can see through walls at that point. So you can intuit the reality of the situation like that, as to who is speaking the truth about what they're seeing and those who are lying about it.
Yes.
This has also been a problem over the last 50 or 100 years everywhere, where you have had all these false gurus emerge everywhere and take all this flock of people into their into their circle, and then abuse and take these people and take their money and their and their honor and what have you. So what I am trying to create with the FSO, what I'm trying to create with the new, is for people to raise themselves from at the beginning to a level where they have that kind of intuition to be able to see the false from the true, right? This is the kind of human that we need to create, because as we are proceeding into this technocratic age, things are not going to become better, they're going to become worse. So the times demand and providence demands that certain human beings on a mass level, if possible, emerge that have those kind of capabilities, that have the ability to see through walls and through canyons. And that's what I'm trying to do with all you guys, to do these practices and deepen yourself with these practices as much as possible, so that your faculties begin to flower. So you begin to see, intuit things, seeing things as they are, so you're living that reality of that prayer of the Prophet himself, where he says, Allahumma anna haqa'iq al-ashya kama hiya, oh God, show us the realities of things as they truly are. This is the kind of people that I am striving to create within the FSO.
That's
We're seeing the
absolutely right,
realities of
Sheikh.
things as they are.
That's absolutely right. And I can testify myself that ever since I've been in the Fatimiyya Sufi order, and the practices that Sheikh Wahid Azal gives the disciples and the murids, if you're truly with positive intention and with purity in your heart for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and your murshid and the order, if you do those practices sincerely and build that relation and build that spiritual connection, then I've had some really groundbreaking experiences recently in the physical realm, in the astral spiritual realm. And that's something that you really have to put in those practices. Each murshid that you will come across in any Sufi order, but specifically for the Fatimiyya I'm speaking, you have to do your spiritual practices. And if you're doing your spiritual practices, then you will get that gnosis where you will see things for what they are. You'll be able to have a higher sense of peace and intuition and the aspect of the divine feminine on what this order is based on. So that is absolutely true what the Sheikh is saying. And it's basically in times such as this, in times of chaos, we need the proper companionship like we have with the FSO, the proper spiritual discipline, the proper spiritual practices, the aspects of contributing a hobby or a skill, not only to the FSO, but to yourself and to your community. So it's all a collective conglomerate that comes together, but you have to make the effort, because if you don't make the effort, then that is also the aspect of free will and predestination, where you will get brought to a certain point. But if you fail to take any action, then that was you individually who chose to do that.
Which in itself is a lesson about, bada.
Yes. And Sheikh, that's absolutely great. And it also brings me for free will and predestination, how even with Crowley, and I know how you've read everything on Crowley, how Islam has influenced him, which we could discuss in a future podcast about Crowley and Islam. And how did free will and do what that willed, and how Islam came into his life. Because I remember about a year ago, it was like a year and a half ago, I had one of his followers message me, and they said that in our leadership or influence of Crowley, we are taught to respect Islam and Muslims with the highest regard.
Yes, that's true. That's true. In fact, one of his most important openings, an operation that he did in I believe it was in either Morocco or the Tunisian desert, back in around 2004, that led to what he claims was the revelation of the Book of the Law. He was actually continually reciting Surah Al-Ikhlas, Qul huwa Allahu ahad, as almost like a zikr, and these opening, this whole Enochian universe that he kind of augmented from the work of John Dee and Edward Kelly came to him as a result of using that surah. So that kind of tells you that on the level of working and on the level of the experiential level, Aleister Crowley owes a lot to the world of Islam. Yeah,
definitely, Sheikh. This has been such an enlightening conversation, this part 14, and it has delved into all of the issues that we're dealing with today, which was the continuation of free will, predestination, the current geopolitics taking place, and how we are doing the work that we're doing and how it can help those that are following the path of the Noor. So do you have any concluding thoughts or anything that I have failed to ask you on this subject?
No, but if anybody wants further clarification, I'm always open on email and they can send me their questions. No problem.
Alhamdulillah. So thank you everyone for joining us for part 14. And inshallah, we will be back in the future for part 15 in this series of dialogues and conversations with our beloved Murshid, Sheikh, friend and brother of the Fatimiyya Sufi Tariqah. And please continue to support this movement and what it represents and reach out to the Sheikh if you have any ability or talent or skill that can help grow the Fatimiyya. And please spread the word about what it is and its teachings in these times of chaos. So without further ado, Nur alaikum and thank you, Sheikh.